What's going on, y'all? It's Big Facts again, coming at you with another video. So all over the media, typically on CNBC, Fox News, CNN, whatever you catch your, wherever you consume your news, or even here on YouTube, Facebook, Twitter, you always hear about the growing national debt. And what sparked my interest on this is, recently we had presidential candidate Elizabeth Warren. She was coming out about relieving student loan debt, and having that debt being cleared and forgiven. And then you've seen in the comment sections of some of these news sources about government spending being outrageous and the debt being at 22 trillion. And that's a huge number. It's something to have some concern of it, but the way the media is putting it out there with their fear-mongering tactics, I think it's totally wrong and disingenuous. And they're not really telling people the truth on what the debt represents. All right. And with that said, what people need to understand is that when you have a debt, you also have to consider, well, what is the national assets? We have a national debt, but what are the assets? Okay. Because we really want to look at what's the net worth of the country. And we're going to get into that with this video. But before we can go further, before I can delve any of it further, I want to give you guys a run through of what the national debt really is, so you can get an understanding of where I'm coming from with this. So when we look at the national debt, you have to understand the definition of the U.S. national debt, which is the total of all deficit spending done by the U.S. government. All right. So many of y'all, if you're listening, probably will wonder, well, what is deficit spending? So we're going to explain that. Deficit spending, that is when the government spends more than what it receives in revenues. Now, the government has revenue sources of taxes, tariffs, also known as custom duties, because when people are importing certain things that the government has instituted tariffs on, all that is a revenue stream to the U.S. government. So, for example, let's say, we see these trade wars that the United States government is having with China, and we institute tariffs on, sneakers that were made in China. So what that says is typically they will come in for like $20, but the government says we're going to institute a $2 tariff for some sneakers that cost about $20. So that extra $2, that sneaker will cost about $22, or if not even more, because that company has to make a profit. But we'll keep it simple. So that sneaker will cost $22, and in that instance, that extra $2, that's a revenue source to the U.S. government. All right. Also, your income taxes, corporate taxes, all that. Like I said earlier, taxes, they're all revenue to the U.S. government. All right, or receipts. I don't want to say revenue. Let's look at it, receipts. And I will get to another reason why I don't, but we'll say that for another video. But those are all receipts to the government. Okay. So on the flip side, if the government collects more than they spend, then we have a budget surplus. All right. Now, many of y'all will be saying like, oh yeah, the government needs to run a budget surplus, but that isn't always the indicator of, good things. Because if you look at the history of that, yeah, we could look at the Clinton years when the government in the later half of the Clinton years was running a budget surplus. Right after that, the U.S. economy fell into a recession. So you have to be mindful of that. And I can show up different instances in U.S. history where that has happened. But when I finish all this, you're going to understand why we have to be careful what we ask for if we want a budget surplus. What more we have to be asking ourselves is we want a balanced economy, all right? We want to make sure that we're spending appropriately to what the economy needs. So, moving on. Now, we explained what deficit spending is, but we want to understand where is the spending being done. So, the government spends in three segments. We have discretionary spending, mandatory spending, and the interest. That's the interest payments on all the debt. That's what I mean by interest. So for starters, discretionary spending, that is Congress appropriated funds for agencies such as the Department of Defense, Health and Human Services, Department of Education, the VA, Department of Homeland Security, the Energy Department, the State Department, NASA, HUD, Housing and Urban Development, all that. That is discretionary spending. So what that is The president comes up with a plan with his team on where they're going to spend X amount of dollars in whatever particular department. Then Congress has to appropriate those funds, whether they approve of that budget that the president proposes to Congress. If they approve of it, then those funds get appropriated to wherever. If they don't, they have to go back and, make it to where Congress would approve it. So that's the discretionary portion of it. Then we have mandatory spending. Now, these are mandated payments or entitlement spending for programs that are mandated by law. Now, what programs are that? That is Social Security and Medicare. Those are mandated by law. So no matter what they try to say about Social Security or Medicare, those are mandated payments. They have to make those payments, okay? Because they were instituted by law. And the only way you could stop that is you have to go back through Congress, and institute law to remove those payments from being done or completed, okay? So that is your mandatory spending. So far we have discretionary spending, we have mandatory spending. Final spending segment is interest. That's the interest payments on the debt. The debt meaning the different bonds, notes, T-bills, which are all the same thing, just depending on the date of maturity. When the government issues those out, they have to pay an interest payment on that. And currently that stands at $393 billion. That's an estimate. Okay. And as time goes on, with the more spending that the government does, that interest payment estimate can potentially rise to about $1 trillion, if not even more. All right, I don't have those figures, those forecasting figures in front of me, but it can reach that. So we have interest payments standing at $393 billion, mandatory spending standing at $2.77 trillion, and then discretionary spending at $1.4 trillion. That's a whole lot of money. All right. And you hear a lot about Social Security being attacked because, mandatory spending is the largest segment at $2.77 trillion. That's a huge lot of money. That's why we hear all this talk about, it going at Social Security. So we now, just to bring things up, we know what the national debt is. We know what deficit spending is. We know where the spending is going in which segments. Now we have to look at, now we're moving on as to why the national debt shouldn't always be of concern. And what we really should be asking is, when somebody asks us about the national debt, what about the debt? We should be saying, well, what about the national assets? Okay. So overall, just to finish it up, for the fiscal year of 2019, that's running from October 1st, 2018 to September 30th, 2019. That's the government's fiscal year. I don't want to go dive in too further on what the fiscal year entails or what it is, but for those of you who have a basic understanding, that's the government's time frame. That currently stands at an estimated amount of $4.6 trillion. That's the estimated amount the government is going to have to spend for the fiscal year of 2019. And the budget is estimated to bring in revenue of $3.43 trillion. So we're definitely going to run a deficit again this year, and it's going to be added to the national debt. And from doing the math, we're going to be running a deficit of $1.16 trillion. That's a lot of money being added to the debt. But hey, we're not to worry about that. Okay? And here's why. We're going to get into it now. So to explain things all, why we shouldn't worry, we have to give you a brief history on how you have to understand money in this modern day economy. All right. So we're going to start off going back to 1971. All right. So August of 1971, the US dollar under President Nixon was ended. Well, President Nixon ended the convertibility of the dollar into gold, or gold into dollar. He removed that. So in that sense, the US dollar was no longer backed by gold, and that ended in August of 1971. So what did that mean? That just changed our debt from something that we now owe or have to pay back, because we can't just go and print out gold. Gold is a finite resource. There's only so much gold in the world, all right? So in that essence, it just changed our debt to just an accounting entry, okay? That's all it did. It wasn't something that we had to owe or get amount of gold to pay back. It just turned it into accounting entry. When President Nixon did that, that's what he did. He turned our debt into an accounting entry. So if we look at the national debt, we have to look at it as more of a national debit, okay? Because the government now is the issuer of dollars, meaning they pump money into the functional economy. So, and many people may be asking right now, like, hey, what are you talking about? Well, how do roads, how do Department of the Defense, the certain contracts that they issue to companies like Lockheed Martin, Boeing, how do they get their money? How do they get their revenue stream? It's not more so from the private side. It's not people like me and you that are going out and buy missiles. It's from the government spending money. The government is awarding these contracts. They are spending money into the economy. When that money gets spent into Boeing or Lockheed Martin, that pays, those employees at those companies, who then take that money to go out to their local grocery store to buy groceries for their family, buy shoes, buy clothes. You see how that money goes down. They take that money, put it in the bank. Other people come into the bank, borrow that money. That's a multiplier effect, which is really what is printing money. The private bank, they are the money printers. They multiply money. So the money that you put in, that you got from the government, is being lent out, at a fraction. It's getting lent out to people now go out, start businesses, take out student loans. And, that's how the economy grows. All right. So the government now is the issuer of dollars. You can't get dollars anywhere else in the world other than from the United States government. They issue dollars. OK, so they pump that money in. And we can't look at households the same way we would look at the government, because you and I are different corporations. The way we handle our finances, we just can't borrow, or create dollars like the federal government. We can't do that. All right. The government has a harder task. They have to now focus on balancing the economy. They have to make sure that there's not too much money being in circulation where we have inflation. We can't have too little money in circulation to where the economy now is going to contract and we don't see growth. So they have to balance things out. They have to make sure things are right all across the board, So that's a much harder task. And with that said, what I mean by the government now has to debit dollars, remember, when you are debiting something in accounting, you have to remember, take into account accounting principles. All right. When you debit something, what you are doing is you're increasing the assets or an expense account. OK, so when the government is spending dollars into the economy, through different departments, through different programs and stuff, what they are doing is they're increasing their expense account. That's all they're doing. They are just increasing their expense account. And what they're doing is, since we, the private sector, people that cannot issue dollars, the public, me, you, the foreigners who come in, who invest in the United States and how to get US dollars, we're now credited dollars. Okay. So when you credit something in accounting, remember this, credits will either increase your liabilities or increase your equities. Okay. So we're getting an increase. That is an asset to us. All right. And equity is an asset. So when we increase, when the government pumps in dollars, their expense account increases, but then our asset sides, which is the equity, which is the dollar, that now increases for us, the private side. Okay. So government debt is nothing but private sector assets. See, part of the national asset, what I'm talking about. Government debt is nothing but private sector assets. So when you look at the debt, and they're going on 22 trillion, blah, 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 all over the media trying to fearmonger, you got to look at it, well, hey, that's an asset to us, the public. Those are assets to us because the government has spent this much in total into the private sector. Now, if they didn't, let's say they had a surplus, well, let's say it was the other way around, the government wasn't going to run a budget deficit of 1.4 trillion, in essence, what that would mean is 1.4 trillion has been sucked out of the private sector. 1.4 trillion is not in the functional economy. We have to look at it like that. All right. So, moreover, the national debt is just, like I said, net financial assets to all the users. Okay? All users, that's all the private sector. You know, it pays for Social Security. Like I said, look at the spending. When the government spends on Social Security, those dollars now go into somebody who's collecting Social Security. That goes into their bank account. That's an asset to them. So the government increased their expense, which now later became an asset to somebody. Because that person's going to take those Social Security payments and pay for whatever it is that they need to. That's an asset. So that's the simplest way you got to look at it. So more so when we want to get back to the original topic. Now, how about the national assets? Now, when you go on the Federal Reserve's website, because all this information is privy to us as the public, it's just you got to know where to look and know how to ask the right questions. That's what the media doesn't try to let you do. Now, the total net assets for all households and nonprofit organizations currently stands at $104 trillion. That is a total assets, total net worth of all households and nonprofit organizations in the United States today, as of the fourth quarter of 2018. Our net worth stands at $104 trillion. So don't tell me about the U.S. national debt that is $22 trillion when the public, the private sector, all U.S. households and nonprofits have a total net worth of $104 trillion. That is phenomenal. So we can handle that national debt. All right. And now you're probably saying, well, what is the total national assets? The total national asset includes all personal assets, all businesses that are not incorporated, all corporation assets and nonprofit organization assets. That is all the total national assets. All right. Minus the liabilities. Okay. Which currently public liabilities stand at 16.1 trillion. Our total assets stand at 120. You minus the 120 from the 16.1 gives us our net worth of $104 trillion. The U.S. national debt is only 22 trillion. The net worth of the United States public is 104 trillion. I can't continue to stress this enough, people. Can't continue to stress this enough. Then when you look at the total, when I talk about the personal assets, corporation assets, nonprofit, everything, businesses all included, that stands at 137 trillion. So per citizen, we're looking at a $417,718 per citizens. That is the total assets per citizen, $417,718. That's incredible. That is incredible. So we are wealthier today than we were 50 years ago, 30 years ago, 20 years ago as a country. Yes, there is a problem of income inequality. That is a huge problem. All right. And we have to combat that. We have to combat that the best way we can. But what we have to take out of this in conclusion is we can't let the debt, the national debt, outpace GDP growth. That is the important part. That's what they're not explaining to you. So if the debt is growing at 2% a year, growth must be 2% or greater. All right. We want to outpace the growth of the national debt. We want to make sure that our economy is growing. People are spending money. Jobs are being created. People are becoming wealthier. That is what we want to do. And we can't do that with income inequality. All right. Just can't. Because one person hoarding the money and hundreds of other people not having an opportunity, one person can't spend, $1 billion the same way 100 people can. It's impossible. He can only drive one car. 100 people, that's 100 cars being sold. That's more jobs. That's more money being pumped into the economy. So we want to put an end to gorging capitalism. We want to put an end to, that type of hoarding. And just to round things off, currently, just to make sure, this is what we have to be cognizant of. Like I said, we have to make sure that the debt does not outpace GDP, because as it stands currently, the United States household debt to GDP stands at 76%. Now, that's not bad, but when we're talking about 100% of household debt, or let's say if we get into the 90s, all right, like it was back in 2008 when it was 98% of GDP, household debt was 98% of GDP. Yeah, that's when we start talking about recession and, the economy collapsing. So we really just want to make sure household debt drops as a percentage of GDP. We want to get our people wealthier. We want to make sure the economy is growing, So the next time they want to fearmonger you about the national debt being at 22 trillion, make sure to remember to tell them, well, all households' net worth is $104 trillion. What we want to make sure is, let's make sure the country is growing. So I want to hear what y'all have to say and what questions y'all have. I'll make sure to leave a link to a lot of interesting videos and where you guys can learn some of this stuff that I've learned. So I want y'all to take a look at this video from Warren Buffett, who basically reiterates some of the same stuff that I've said. So I want to hear what y'all have to say. Like, comment, and subscribe down below. I'm out.
Now we have to stabilize the debt as a percentage of GDP, which means we can have debt increase by 2 to 3% a year if GDP grows 2 to 3% a year. And I think that's a very realistic possibility.